The village of Merib Ben lay still beneath the weight of the morning mist, clinging to the earth like a weary traveler unwilling to rise. The Skag River, wide and steady, cut through the landscape, its surface a muted gray under the overcast sky. Thomas Reed sat in his small fishing boat, his hands moving by instinct as he pulled in his nets. The wood of the oars was worn smooth from years of use, though they saw little of it now. He barely fished to trade anymore, only enough to get by, to keep himself fed and occupied. The silence of the river suited him. It was the only thing that did. 3 years had passed since the accident. 3 years since the river had swallowed his world whole, leaving him adrift in a life he no longer recognized. CLA and Lily, his wife and daughter, gone in an instant. One moment they had been laughing, the wind tugging at Lily's golden hair as she reached out toward the water. The next, the sky had split open with the force of the storm, waves surging up like hungry hands, tearing them from the boat. He had searched, fought, screamed until his throat was raw, but the river had only answered with silence. They had been found miles downstream, their bodies cold and still, their laughter forever lost to the current. And Thomas had never been the same. The villagers whispered about him in hushed voices, sparing glances filled with pity or wariness. Once he had been one of them, laughing in the tavern, trading fish and stories, a man who belonged. Now he was a ghost of himself, a shadow that haunted the riverbanks, speaking only when necessary, existing but never truly living. He had cut himself off, not out of hatred for the people of Merib Ben, but because nothing they said could change the truth. Nothing could bring back what he had lost. The weight of memory sat heavy on his chest as he reeled in his final catch of the morning. The net surfaced, glistening with silver scales, the fish flopping uselessly in protest. He pulled out a particularly large salmon, its belly round and firm, and placed it in his bucket. He would salt and dry it later. His hands worked mechanically, but his mind was elsewhere, drifting through time, lost in the past. A sound broke through the quiet. At first it was nothing more than a rustle, the faint disturbance of underbrush shifting on the riverbank. Thomas barely registered it. The forest was full of movement, rabbits, foxes, the occasional deer stepping lightly through the trees. But then the rustling grew heavier, the crunch of twigs snapping beneath weight. He glanced up, expecting to see a stag, or perhaps even a wolf. But what he saw made his breath still in his chest. A bear stood at the water's edge. She was thin, her fur matted, ribs just visible beneath her thick coat. She did not move like a predator, nor did she seem aggressive. Instead, she simply stood there, watching him. Thomas tightened his grip on his fishing knife. He had seen bears before, but they usually kept to themselves, wary of human presence. This one, however, did not turn away. Her dark eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent a strange shiver through him. Not fear, but something else. He stayed still, watching her as she watched him. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of fish from his boat to the riverbank. The bear took a step forward, then another. Her massive paws pressed into the damp earth. Thomas's pulse quickened, but still, he did not move. Then the bear did something unexpected. She lowered her head, not in aggression, not in preparation to lunge, but almost as if she were pleading. Thomas hesitated. Something about the way she moved, the way her body tensed and her eyes flickered toward the trees behind her, unsettled him. It was as though she were waiting for something, expecting something. The thought made his fingers loosen on the knife. Before he even fully registered his own movement, he reached into his bucket and pulled out the salmon. With a swift, practiced motion, he tossed it toward the shore. The fish landed with a dull thud on the wet ground, and the bear immediately lunged forward, snatching it up in her powerful jaws. Thomas expected her to retreat then, to turn and disappear into the forest, but she did not. Instead, she stood still, chewing quickly, her dark eyes never leaving him. And then, just as suddenly, she turned toward the trees. She took a few steps, stopped and looked back at him. Something about the way she moved, hesitant but purposeful, made Thomas frown. It was as if she wanted something, as if she expected him to follow. That was ridiculous. Bears did not ask for help, and yet the longer he watched her, the stronger the feeling grew. He glanced down at his boat.
At the nets waiting to be untangled, at the work still to be done, Then he looked back at the bear, standing at the tree line, waiting. For the first time in 3 years, something stirred in him, something he had thought long dead. He pulled in his nets, secured his bucket, and stepped onto the shore. And he followed. The damp earth gave way beneath Thomas Reed's boots as he followed the bear. Into the thick of the forest, the trees stretched high above him, their branches tangled like outstretched fingers, filtering the gray morning light into dappled patches that danced across the mossy ground. The air smelled of wet bark and decaying leaves, the deep scent of the wilderness untouched by man. It had been years since he had wandered this far from the river, years since he had bothered stepping beyond the familiar path leading from his cabin to his boat. Yet here he was, trailing behind a creature that should have been nothing but a threat, but instead felt like something else entirely, something he could not yet name. The bear moved with purpose, her pace steady but not rushed, pausing only to glance back at him every few steps. She wanted him to follow. Thomas did not understand why, but the logic of it no longer seemed to matter. A strange pull had taken root in his chest, something deep and instinctual, something that urged him forward despite the years of indifference weighing him down. He barely noticed the brambles that snagged at his sleeves, the way the dampness of the earth soaked into his worn boots. His focus remained on the bear and the unseen destination ahead. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. Even the birds, which had chirped noisily by the river, seemed hesitant to disturb whatever lay beyond the thick curtain of trees. The bear picked up her pace, her muscles rippling beneath her shaggy fur, but there was no aggression in her movements, only urgency. Thomas adjusted his grip on the fishing knife at his belt, more out of habit than fear. He had no intention of harming the animal, but the wild was unpredictable, and instinct told him to be prepared. Then he heard it, a sound, faint at first but unmistakable, high-pitched. Broken whimpers carried through the trees on the whisper of the wind. Thomas stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The bear did the same, standing rigid as the cries echoed once more. They were not the sounds of pain, nor the calls of an animal in the throes of death. They were the cries of something lost, something frightened. The bear let out a low chuff, her massive head turning toward him for a brief moment before she pressed forward. The sound grew louder with each step, rising and falling in desperate, helpless bursts. And then, as Thomas pushed past a tangle of undergrowth, the source became clear. The ravine stretched before them, its walls steep and slick with moisture. At the bottom, caught between the craggy rocks and tangled brush, were just small bear cubs. Their fur was darker than their mother's, thick but unkempt, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. They had likely been trapped for hours, maybe longer. One of them clawed weakly at the earth, trying to scramble upward, but the incline was too sharp, the ground too loose. The other simply whimpered, curling into itself, eyes darting between its sibling and the towering shape of its mother above. Thomas exhaled slowly. He had expected something, though he had not known what. But this was a situation that demanded action. He glanced at the mother bear, her body tense, her dark eyes shifting between him and her cubs below. It was clear she had tried to reach them herself, but had been unable to climb down, without risking the same fate. That was why she had come to him. Not for food, not for pity, but for help. Thomas hesitated only a moment longer before moving. Years ago, he would have done this without question. He had once been a man who helped, who acted. That man had drowned in the Skag River alongside his wife and daughter, and the shell he had become had long since refused the call of duty. But as he stared down at the helpless cubs, their tiny bodies shivering against the cold stone, he felt something stir in his chest, something that made his hands move. Before his mind could catch up, his rope was still coiled at his belt, worn from years of use, but sturdy enough for what he needed. With practiced efficiency, he found a tree at the edge of the ravine, wrapping the rope around its thick base before securing the knot. He tested the strength, giving it a hard tug before gripping it tightly in his calloused hands. The bear did not move, did not interfere. She only watched, waiting, trusting. Thomas eased himself over the edge, the rope burning against his palms as he descended. The ground crumbled beneath his boots, sending small rocks tumbling into the depths. But he remained steady, his grip firm. The cubs flinched at first, pressing themselves against the stone, their fear evident. but he spoke softly as he lowered himself to their level. His voice was rough from disuse, but gentle, the way he had once spoken to Lily when she had been frightened of the dark. "It's all right," he murmured. "I'm not going to hurt you." The larger of the two cubs, the one who had been trying to climb, eyed him warily but did not move away. The other remained curled against the rocks, its small body rising and falling in rapid, panicked breaths. Thomas reached out slowly, his fingers brushing against the damp fur, feeling the rapid heartbeat beneath. They were too young to survive if they remained trapped here much longer. With careful movements, he looped the rope around the first cub's body, securing it just enough to support its weight. The mother bear made a deep, throaty rumble that sent a shiver down his spine, but she did not lunge, did not stop him. Instead, she remained at the edge, her ears twitching, her eyes locked onto his every movement. Thomas tugged the rope, signaling the cub to climb. It struggled at first, its small limbs unsure, but instinct kicked in, and it began to move. The incline was still too steep for it to manage alone, but with the support of the rope, it made progress. Thomas kept a steady hold, his muscles burning with the effort, until the cub finally scrambled over the edge, where its mother immediately nudged it closer, inspecting it for injuries. One down, one to go. Thomas turned to the second cub, the smaller of the two. This one would be harder. It was weaker, more afraid, its limbs shaking as he reached for it. He did the same as before, looping the rope gently around its body, murmuring quiet reassurances. Though he knew the cub did not understand his words, but words were not what mattered, only intent. This time, as he began the climb, the cub's movements were sluggish. It faltered halfway up, its strength giving out, and for a moment, Thomas thought they would both fall. His grip tightened, his arms screaming in protest, but he refused to let go. "Come on," he gritted through clenched teeth. Almost there. The cub let out a weak cry, but it did not stop moving. Inch by inch, they ascended, the weight of the past pressing down on Thomas as heavily as the effort it took to climb. And then, with one final push, they reached the top. He collapsed onto the ground, breathless, as the mother bear nosed her cubs, checking them over. He half expected her to turn on him then, to lash out now that her need for him was over. But she didn't. Instead, she lifted her great head, her dark eyes meeting his. There was something there not human, not entirely readable, but it was not hostility. It was something close to acknowledgement. Then, without another sound, she turned and led her cubs into the forest, vanishing into the trees. Thomas lay there for a long time, staring at the sky, his chest rising and falling in deep, ragged breaths, and for the first time in years, the weight of grief felt just a little lighter. The path back to the river felt different. Thomas Reed's legs were heavy, aching from the strain of the climb, but the weight in his chest was unfamiliar. It wasn't the usual dull press of grief that he had carried for years, nor was it the numbing emptiness that had settled over him after the accident. It was something else, something lighter, but no less unsettling. The forest still stretched around him in its endless sprawl of green and brown. The damp scent of moss thickened the air, but it no longer felt suffocating. He had moved through these trees in a way he hadn't in years, not as a man seeking to avoid the world, but as something else. A participant, an answer to a call, even if it had come from a creature that should have meant nothing to him. The memory of the bear's eyes stayed with him, lingering like an unspoken question. He had expected the mother to flee with her cubs, to vanish into the depths of the wild without a backward glance. Instead, she had looked at him, really looked at him. He had spent 3 years avoiding the gaze of others, but in that moment, he had not turned away. He had met it, unflinching, and he had understood. His boots sank into the mud as he reached the riverbank, the familiar sight of his boat breaking through the haze of his thoughts. The Skag River was the same as always, its steady current carrying whispers of time forward, indifferent to those who lingered along its banks. He climbed aboard with practiced ease, his body moving through the motions before his mind could catch up. His hands untied the ropes, adjusted the oars, and steadied the weight of his catch-all actions performed 100 times over. But this time, as he pushed off from the shore, something felt different. He glanced once more toward the tree line, half expecting to see the bear watching him. But there was nothing, only the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the gentle lapping of the river against his boat. The village of Merib Bend came into view as he drifted downstream, its collection of weathered cottages and wooden piers stretching along the river's curve. Smoke curled from chimneys, mixing with the scent of fresh bread from the bakery and the salt of drying fish. The sight of it had once brought him a sense of belonging. Now, it was merely a place he passed through, a cluster of buildings that served as a necessary stop between solitude and survival. As he neared the dock, he saw movement along the pier, villagers tending to their boats, chatting in small clusters, their laughter drifting over the water in bursts of sound that felt foreign to him. He had been part of that once. He had stood among them, exchanged stories, shared drinks at the tavern. Now he was a man apart, a figure known but unspoken of, pitied but not pursued. He tied his boat to the dock, moving with the quiet efficiency that had become second nature, his presence barely acknowledged by those around him. But as he hauled his bucket of fish onto the pier, a voice cut through the usual hum of the village. "Thomas," he turned, surprised by the sound of his own name spoken aloud. Samuel, the butcher's boy, stood a few feet away, his small frame half hidden behind a stack of wooden crates. The boy had always been curious, always watching Thomas from a distance, but never daring to speak. Until now. Thomas said nothing at first, only raising an eyebrow in question. Samuel hesitated, shifting his weight from foot to foot before blurting out, "Did you really see a bear?" The murmurs of the villagers quieted. Heads turned, eyes flickered toward him, curiosity replacing the usual indifference. Thomas clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the handle of his bucket. He should have known word would spread. The woods were not silent, not truly. Someone must have seen him following the bear, or perhaps one of the hunters had come across the tracks. He considered ignoring the question, brushing past the boy without an answer. But something about the way Samuel looked at him wide-eyed, expectant, made him pause. He could hear Lily in his voice, see her in the way he fidgeted, unable to contain his excitement. He exhaled slowly, then nodded. "I did." The villagers exchanged glances, some skeptical, others intrigued. And Samuel pressed, stepping closer. "What happened?" Thomas hesitated, feeling the weight of their attention settle over him like an unfamiliar cloak. He had spent so long avoiding this conversation, connection, anything that tied him to the world beyond the river. But the boy's eagerness chipped away at his resistance, and before he could stop himself, he spoke. "She needed help." A murmur ran through the small gathering. An old fisherman scoffed. "A bear needing help? You sure it wasn't luring you into the trees to eat you?" Laughter rippled through the group, but Thomas didn't react. He could still hear the cub's cries, still feel the strain in his arms as he had pulled them to safety. "She had cubs," he said, his voice steady. The laughter faded. "They were trapped in a ravine. She couldn't reach them, so I climbed down." Silence followed. It was the longest he had spoken to any of them in years, and he could see the shift in their expressions, the way curiosity turned to something else, something closer to understanding. Samuel's eyes were wide with wonder. "And you saved them?" Thomas nodded. "They're safe now." For a moment, no one spoke. Then, to his surprise, the old fisherman who had scoffed before let out a low chuckle. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, shaking his head. "The river takes, and the river gives, eh?" Thomas stiffened. He wanted to bristle at the words, to reject them outright, but something in him faltered. The river had taken everything from him, but today had it not also given him something? He didn't know. He wasn't ready to know. Instead of responding, he turned toward the market stalls, placing his bucket of fish down for trade. The villagers did not press him further, but the whispers lingered as he moved through the crowd. For the first time in years, they were looking at him not as a ghost, not as a man trapped in grief, but as something else, as a man who had stepped forward when called. As he walked home that evening, the village sounds fading behind him, he felt the weight in his chest shift once more. He had followed the bear into the woods expecting nothing, but as he reached the worn steps of his cabin, he realized that something had changed. He was still grieving, still lost in ways he could not yet articulate, but the silence no longer felt as suffocating. For the first time in years, something had reached him through the fog. Something had asked something of him, and he had answered. He did not know what that meant, not yet, But as he sat on his porch, staring out at the river that had once taken everything, he wondered if perhaps, one day, he would. The days that followed were not so different from those before, and yet, everything had changed. Thomas Reed still rose before the sun, still walked the familiar worn path to the river, still cast his nets with hands that knew the water better than they knew anything else. But something in the air had shifted, something he could not quite name. The villagers no longer averted their gazes when he passed. They watched him now, some with quiet respect, others with open curiosity, but none with the pity that had once defined every glance thrown his way. Samuel, the butcher's boy, had taken to lingering near the docks whenever Thomas returned from fishing, hovering just close enough to pretend he was there for some other reason. Though his eager eyes betrayed him every time, Thomas never said anything about it, but he didn't tell the boy to leave either. The river, ever steady, had become something new in his eyes. It had been his prison for years, the place where his life had ended though his body remained. Now, he was no longer sure. He still felt the pull of sorrow each time he watched the water ripple beneath his boat, still saw flashes of Lily's laughter in the movement of the waves, still heard the echo of Cla's voice in the hush of the current. But there was something else now, something that hadn't been there before. He thought of the bear's pleading eyes, the weight of the cubs in his arms as he had climbed the ravine, the way the mother had looked at him before vanishing into the trees. It had been the first time in 3 years that something other than grief had taken hold of him. And no matter how much he tried to tell himself, it had been nothing, just an act, just a moment. It lingered like a whisper beneath his skin. He told himself it didn't mean anything. But when Samuel finally worked up the courage to speak to him again, Thomas didn't turn away. The boy had come to the docks at sunset, his arms crossed over his chest as if bracing himself, though his expression was full of determination. "You fish alone every day," Samuel said, and Thomas, who had expected the boy to ask another question about the bear, simply grunted in response. I mean, I'd like to learn." The words came fast, like they had been sitting on the tip of his tongue for days, waiting for the right moment to escape. Thomas paused, his fingers tightening around the coil of rope in his hands, and for a moment, he considered dismissing the boy. He had spent years avoiding company, years making sure no one got close. But Samuel was just a child, just a boy with bright eyes and too much energy, a boy who reminded him of someone he had once known, once loved. Thomas sighed and nodded toward the boat. "Get in." Samuel's face lit up with surprise, and then excitement, and before Thomas could change his mind, the boy had scrambled into the boat, his movements unsteady but eager. Thomas shoved off from the dock, the oars cutting through the river with practiced ease, and for the first time in a long while, he was not alone on the water. The boy asked questions about the nets, the fish, the best times to catch certain kinds, but Thomas answered only when necessary. He was not a teacher, not anymore, but Samuel didn't seem to mind the silence. He watched everything with sharp eyes, paying attention in a way that reminded Thomas of himself at that age, back when he had learned from his own father, before he had ever met Cla, before he had ever held Lily in his arms, before the river had taken and taken and taken. The boy struggled with the knots, his small hands clumsy as he tried to tie them the way Thomas had shown him. It should have been frustrating, should have made Thomas regret letting him come along, but instead, he reached over and guided Samuel's fingers, showing him the right way, the way his father had once shown him. Samuel grinned when he got it right, and Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a crack in the wall he had built around himself. When they returned to shore, the sky painted in hues of orange and violet. Samuel jumped from the boat, his feet landing on the dock with an eager thud. "Can I come again?" he asked, and Thomas, without thinking, nodded. The boy ran off before he could take it back. That night, as Thomas sat on his porch, the sounds of the village quieting in the distance, he thought of how different the day had been, how different he felt. He had spent years convincing himself that he had nothing left to give, that whatever part of him had once belonged to the world had drowned with Cla and Lily. But standing on that boat, watching Samuel struggle and try again, he had not felt empty. He had felt something else, something unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Days turned into weeks, and Samuel became a fixture in Thomas's routine. He showed up every morning, sometimes before Thomas had even left his cabin. His eager hands ready to pull nets, to learn, to ask too many questions. The boy's enthusiasm was relentless, but Thomas found that he did not mind. The silence he had once craved now felt different, less like a necessity and more like a habit he wasn't sure he needed anymore. The village took notice, though they said little. Some watched with quiet approval, others with mild curiosity, but no one questioned it. Perhaps they knew better than to interfere, or perhaps they understood what Thomas himself was only beginning to. Then, one afternoon, the sky darkened too quickly. Thomas had seen storms roll in before, had learned to read the wind, the way the clouds stretched heavy and low over the water. He had been about to turn the boat back when Samuel, standing at the edge with his line cast, suddenly lost his footing. It happened fast. The boy slipped, his arms flailing, and before Thomas could reach him, he was in the water. The river, dark and hungry, swallowed him whole. Thomas moved without thinking. The fear that gripped him was instant, all-consuming. But it was not the fear of loss, it was the fear of reliving. His breath caught in his throat as the past crashed into the present, as the sound of water filled his ears, as his body remembered the weight of helplessness, the way it had felt to search and find nothing. But then he saw Samuel's head break the surface, heard the frantic splashing, and something snapped inside him. He dove in. The water was cold, the current strong, but his body moved with purpose. His hands found the boy, gripping tightly, pulling him close. Samuel coughed, sputtered, his arms locking around Thomas's neck as Thomas kicked hard against the pull of the river. The shore was too far, the boat unreachable, but he swam without hesitation, without fear. He swam because this time, he could. This time, he would not lose. When they finally reached land, both gasping, both shaking, Thomas collapsed onto his back, his chest heaving. Samuel clung to him for a moment before pulling away, his small frame trembling but alive. Thomas stared up at the sky, his breath unsteady, his pulse racing. And then, for the first time in 3 years, he laughed. It was hoarse, almost foreign to his own ears, but it was real. Samuel looked at him, wide-eyed, confused, then grinned. "You saved me," the boy said, his voice raw with awe, and Thomas, still breathless, still aching, nodded. The river had taken from him once, but today it had given him something back. The morning after the storm smelled of damp earth and renewal, the scent of the river clinging to the air as though it, too, had felt the weight of what had happened the day before. Thomas Reed stood at the edge of the dock, the wood beneath his boots still slick from the rain, his eyes tracing the gentle ripple of the current. It was calmer today, almost as if it had softened, as if it no longer held the same cruel edge it once had. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the crisp air, letting the weight of the moment settle. Samuel had been fine shaken, cold but fine. The boy had clung to him after they crawled onto shore, his small fingers gripping Thomas's sleeve with a quiet desperation. But there had been something else in his gaze, something Thomas hadn't seen in years. Trust, unwavering, absolute trust. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at him that way. The village had gathered quickly when they returned, drawn by the commotion, by the sight of Thomas hauling Samuel through the muddy streets, both of them dripping with river water, their breath still uneven from the fight against the current. Samuel's mother had pulled the boy into her arms, sobbing into his damp hair, while the others stood watching, their expressions unreadable. And then, to Thomas's great surprise, one of the fishermen had clapped him on the back, a firm, solid gesture that carried more weight than words ever could. Others followed nods of approval, murmurs of respect, a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted. He was no longer just the man who had lost. He was no longer just a shadow lingering at the river's edge. He had saved a life, and in doing so, perhaps, he had begun to save himself. Samuel had come back the next morning, just as Thomas had known he would. The boy had been nervous, hesitant as he stood at the threshold of the dock, shifting from foot to foot, his usual energy subdued. But there had been no fear in his eyes, no lingering doubt, only determination. "Are we fishing today?" he had asked, and Thomas, without a second's hesitation, had nodded. Because of course they were. They had work to do. Now, as he pulled the nets from the water, the boy standing at his side mimicking his movements with an eager focus, Thomas felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. It was not the grief that had clung to him for so long, nor the aching emptiness that had followed him like a ghost. It was something else, something steadier, a quiet, resolute acceptance that the world had not ended with the river's cruelty, that perhaps it never truly had. He had just stopped looking forward. But today, with the weight of the nets in his hands, with the morning light catching the water's surface in gentle ripples, he realized he was looking forward now. Samuel struggled with the knots again, cursing under his breath, and Thomas smirked, reaching over to fix it with an ease that came from years of practice. "You'll get it," he said, and the boy huffed but nodded, his hands working to mimic Thomas's even after the knot had already been tied. The sun was rising higher now, warming the chill left behind by the storm, and as they worked, Thomas found himself glancing toward the distant tree line. He had not seen the bear again, not since that day in the ravine, but he had not expected to. She had come when she needed him, and now she was gone. That was the way of things. The wild did not linger where it did not have to, but still, sometimes, in the quiet moments, he wondered if she was out there, watching, knowing. The boat rocked gently as Samuel leaned over the side, peering into the water as though he could see the fish moving beneath. "Do you think they remember you?" the boy asked suddenly, his voice thoughtful, and Thomas frowned. "Who, the cubs?" "The mother," Samuel straightened, turning toward him. "Do you think they know you saved them?" Thomas exhaled slowly, adjusting the net in his hands. It was a question he hadn't considered, not in the way the boy meant it. He had not saved them for recognition, nor had he expected anything in return. It had been instinct, a call he had answered without thinking, without hesitating. The way he had answered for Samuel, the way he had not been able to answer for Lily. The thought twisted something in his chest, a dull ache that no longer consumed him, but still lingered in the quiet spaces of his mind. He met Samuel's gaze, the boy watching him with the kind of curiosity only a child could possess, and he found himself answering honestly. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I don't think it matters." Samuel considered this, then nodded, satisfied. "I think they do," he said simply, and with that, he turned back to his work. The morning passed with an easy rhythm, the work keeping their hands busy, their minds focused. By the time they returned to shore, the village was stirring to life. The sound of merchants setting up their stalls, the clatter of carts moving through the streets. Thomas docked the boat, stepping onto the pier as Samuel hauled the bucket of fish behind him, his small frame straining under the weight. It was a sight that should have been ridiculous, but instead, Thomas felt something dangerously close to amusement tug at the corner of his mouth. He let the boy struggle for a moment longer before finally relieving him of the load. The villagers greeted them with nods, a few words of acknowledgement, nothing grand or dramatic. But something had changed. Thomas could feel it in the way they looked at him, in the way they no longer averted their gazes, but met his with quiet understanding. He had spent years as an outsider, years believing that the world had moved on without him. But today, as he stood among them, he realized that he had never truly been alone. He had only convinced himself he was. As the sun climbed higher, he made his way back to his cabin, the familiar path feeling less like an exile and more like a homecoming. The river stretched beside him, its steady hum a song he had once loved, then hated. And now he wasn't sure. He reached the porch, pausing for a moment before stepping inside, his fingers lingering on the doorframe. There were still ghosts here, still echoes of laughter that would never return, still memories that would never fade, but they no longer held him in place. That evening, as he sat on the porch, the village quieting in the distance, he found himself looking toward the forest once more. He did not expect to see anything. The bear was gone, the story complete. And yet, as the last light of day stretched long shadows across the earth, movement flickered between the trees. He did not stand, did not move, only watched as the shape of the bear emerged from the dark, standing at the edge of the tree line, silent, still. She did not come closer, nor did he call out. There was no need. They simply looked at each other, the distance between them filled with something that was neither gratitude nor obligation, but something else entirely, understanding. Then, as quietly as she had come, she turned and vanished into the wild once more. Thomas exhaled, his hands resting on his knees, the weight in his chest shifting, settling, easing. Tomorrow, he would wake before the sun. He would walk to the river. He would fish. He would teach. He would live. And for the first time in a long, long while, he knew that would be enough.